Good afternoon, everybody. I hope that our attendants are slowly starting to join. My name is Kirill Avramov, and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies, and also a part of the Global Disinformation Lab and a fellow to the Intelligence Studies Project. Now, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Intelligence Studies Project, Strauss Center for International Security and Law, Clement Center for National Security at UT Austin, to today's event that is dedicated to the presentation and a conversation with one of the most thought-provocative and controversial in a positive way book that came out recently that scrutinizes the nature and the philosophy of warfare, and by some critics, the author has been recognized as the new Sun Tzu. And it's my distinct pleasure to have Dr. Sean McFate, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a professor of strategy at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and the National Defense University. He is also an advisor to Oxford University's Center for Technology and Global Affairs. McFate is a leading expert on mercenaries and privatization of force, and is a regular consultant to the Pentagon, the CIA, and also Hollywood. His career began as a paratrooper and an officer in the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division. Professor McFate then became a private military contractor, and he has authored The New Rules of War, How America Can Win Against Russia, China, and Other Threats, a book that we'll discuss today, which was named as a book of the year by The Economist and included in a West Point's Commandant's reading list. McFate also authored The Modern Mercenaries, Private Armies, and What They Mean for the World Order by the Oxford University Press. And he has written also for the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, The New Republic, Foreign Policy, and Politico. As a scholar, he has authored book chapters in edited academic volumes and 2 monographs on the modern war for the U.S. Department of Defense. Dr. McFate holds a BA from Brown University, MPP from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and a PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics. Dr. McFate, it is a distinct pleasure to have you today with us. And without further ado, I'd like to invite you to present this highly acclaimed book, and then later on have discussions, as here at UT and the Intelligence Studies Project, we follow the trends which are connected to those changing rules, and of course, their implications for the future of intelligence. Dr. McFate.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you to everybody today. I'm going to put up my slides without further ado. So first, can you see the slides? No? Let me get back here. It's my end. I like to blame technology, but not this time. Let's try it now.
It's visible now, sir.
Okay. How's that? Is that good? Okay.
Yeah.
So first of all, I wrote this book. First of all, this book is not written like an academic dry treatise. It is written to be read. Like you could read it in an airport, you could read it in a library, that my mother could understand it. And I wrote it because I was angry. I was angry. As a, like some of you, I have lost good friends in Iraq and Afghanistan. As an American taxpayer, it is sickening to see trillions of dollars spent overseas with very little to show for it, in my opinion. And also, as a veteran, as a vet, it's disheartening to see the United States of America getting, struggling against low-level foes like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And the question is this: how did we go from this, the end of World War II, to, victory, to this? We have forever wars. I mean, we have the best military in the world. We have the best troops, the best training, the best technology. Even our adversaries know this and admit it. But if we are honest with ourselves, the last time we decisively won a big war was 1945. So what's the problem? This is what the book answers. It analyzes what is the problem. Why hasn't the U.S. with the best military in the world, the unipolar superpower, why does it keep on struggling against low-level foes? And the answer up front is this: warfare has moved on, but we have not. Warfare has moved on, but we have not. We have Victor's curse, what I call Victor's curse. And perhaps many of you have heard the adage that generals always fight the last war, especially if they won it. That happens to be true within our military today. Obviously not all generals and not all policymakers, but many of them do. Now, rather than me going into like what is going on in our armed forces today, it might be better to look at a case study of Victor's curse so you know how it impacts strategic thought. So let's get in our time machine. Let's go back 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago, to this war. One of the most brutal wars in human history, World War I. Now, when it was done, the French had a bad case of Victor's curse. That's Clemenceau in the middle at the Versailles Treaty. He's with a bushy mustache. He thought the next war would look just like the last successful one, which is World War I. So the French, thought that would be trench warfare. And what did they invest their money in? What was their super weapon in between wars? It was the Maginot Line, one of the most sophisticated military fortification systems in the world and in world history. Now, this is the Maginot Line, and perhaps some of you have been there. It is designed to stop a German invasion on the border and sink into a long war of trench warfare, attrition-based war, which is what they saw in World War I. Now, we know how this story ends. The Germans changed their way of warfare into something called the Blitzkrieg and easily outflanked and outmaneuvered the Maginot Line, making it nothing but expensive, obsolete junk. And what the Germans could not achieve in 40 years of World War I, they achieved in 46 days in 1940. And they did it because they changed their way of warfare. Meanwhile, France stood still, mired in the glory of its past until the panzers were marching down or driving down Parisian boulevards. And even then, the French high command was locked in cognitive dissonance, not understanding how this could happen to them. So this is Victor's curse. Most people who have Victor's curse think they're looking forward, but they're really looking in the rearview mirror at the glory days. And for the United States, it's this, World War II. And you see this all the time in Washington, D.C. You see this on Department of Defense war games. You see this in the think tanks here. They imagine a future war is going to look like World War II with better technology. And, we're going to talk about, is that true or not? But I do want to let you know that true war prophets do exist. They see the future of war. And for those of you, sorry, this always happens to me. For those of you who are in the intelligence field, think about, can you be a true prophet? They are almost never believed because they have something called Cassandra's curse. This is the power to see the future, but nobody believes you. Cassandra's curse, from Princess Cassandra of the Iliad, who saw the gods gave her the power of foresight, but the curse that everybody disbelieved her. For example, the Trojan horse. So let's go to this gentleman, Billy Mitchell. Perhaps some of you have heard of him. He was an American Army aviator in World War I. And he saw the future of war, and it was air power. And when he came back to Washington, D.C. as a one-star, he told all of his peers the future of war is air power. Let's get ready now, it's air power. And they laughed at him. They scowled at him. And they said, Billy, come on. We all know the future war is trench warfare. It's going to be with better technology, better machine guns. Look at what the French are doing with the Maginot Line. And he said, no, no, no. You don't understand. War's already moved past us. And then he said something very heretical. He said, in the future, airplanes will sink battleships. And when he said that, the airplane was little more than a motorized kite in the era of the super dreadnought. And they howled, they screamed, but Mitchell had some grit, and he convinced the Department of Navy to pull out a captured German warship, battleship from World War I into the Chesapeake Bay, where he did this. He sank it using airplanes. Now, do you think this sparked a great intellectual debate in Washington about the future of war, the potential of air power? No, of course it didn't. What the Navy said is like, look, that doesn't prove anything, Mitchell. That's just a publicity stunt to advance your career. Those are not combat conditions. You know, this would never happen in real life, et cetera, et cetera. And Mitchell said, no, no, no. I said I could do it. It's proof of concept. Let's go from there. Let's develop a strategy from there. Well, this debate erupted outside of the War Department, which was then, you know, before the Pentagon, into congressional politics and national news in like 1921, in a pre-Twitter age. And it became a big deal because a lot of members of Congress, a lot of people in the United States said, well, you know, maybe Mitchell has a point. And this got so bad that General Pershing, who was then sort of the CGSC, the head general of the War Department, pulled Mitchell aside and said, you know, Billy, I think to save your career, we need to get you out of DC just for a little while. Just let the debate simmer down. And so in classic military fashion, they sent him on a 1-year tour in the Pacific, a 1-year overseas tour someplace in the Pacific, just to get him out of DC. And sure enough, the debate calmed down. But when Mitchell came back, he came back with a report this thick, like an old phone book. And in this report, he said that in the future, Japan will launch a sneak attack against the United States in Pearl Harbor, and they will do it using airplanes. And they will do it on a Sunday morning at 8:30 a.m. And this will drag the United States and Japan into a total war of the Pacific. Now, when Mitchell said this, it was 1924. 1924. Now, what happens to Billy Mitchell? Do you think that, you know, the Navy says, well, we should look at the defenses of Hawaii and Pearl Harbor? No, that's not what happens. What they do is they court-martial him. They court-martial Billy Mitchell for insubordination. And this is not just any court-martial. It's like a Kim Kardashian court-martial with paparazzi and corrupt judges, and 3 of the judges being thrown away or thrown out. And the jury was, none of them were aviators. And it was like, you know, rigged. And they found him guilty within 30 minutes of deliberation. And he tore off his uniform and said, screw this. I am leaving. And he leaves the military, and he spends the last few years of his bitter life crisscrossing the United States, telling anybody who would listen to him, the future of war is air power. The future of war is air power. Let's get ready for this. Now, we know how this ends. He dies in the 1930s. Pearl Harbor happens in 1941. The Navy and the military said they were caught completely by surprise. It was a strategic surprise, even though one of their own generals was standing on desks 15 years earlier. He had seen the future of war, but he was not just discounted, but tarred and feathered. Tarred and feathered, because he had, you know, Cassandra's curse. And the reason is this, and here's the important part. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. What this means is that our strategic culture eclipses our strategic IQ when we're thinking about the future of war. because there are people who get it, but they're almost always eaten by the blob, which is the Washington consensus, the herd mentality of Washington, D.C. And here's what he was facing in his day. If you wanted to be, for example, a four-star admiral, it was all about serving on battleships. For hundreds of years, battleships, man-o-wars, frigates had been the king of the sea. It's how countries measured their sovereign power, how many capital ships they had. In the 1890s or 80s, we had something called the Great White Fleet Tour, which went around the world showing off American power. And then here comes Billy Mitchell, an army puke, and he says, no. It says that early 1920s. No, battleships they're obsolete. In the future, it's going to be the aircraft carrier. And when he said this, an aircraft carrier was very experimental. I mean, even stunt pilots wouldn't land on it. And he was saying, and of course, the Admiralty and others laughed at him at this absurd idea that the battleship could be absurd. And it took these traditionally minded people the Battle of Midway, arguably the most decisive naval engagement of the last century. It was fought entirely with aviation. Never did the two fleets see each other. Only after this did these doubting Thomases of, admirals and generals and experts understand, oh, that's what Mitchell was talking about. Now, the military did not apologize to Mitchell, not up front. They kind of apologized to him in their own military way by naming a bomber after him. But as you can see, today, after World War II, everybody stopped buying battleships and started to buy aircraft carriers. And to this day, the aircraft carrier has replaced the battleship as the king of the sea. This is Mitchell's legacy. As well as this. This is the B-25 Mitchell bomber, the only bomber the U.S. ever made in World War II, named after a human being. This is the military's thank you for your service, sir, to Billy Mitchell. So the thing I argue in my book is that we are facing a Billy Mitchell moment right now. We are facing a Billy Mitchell moment. Today now it's great power competition. Perhaps some of you have heard of this. And it really means, how do we fight a war against these two guys, China and Russia? So in 2018, the National Defense Strategy pivoted American strategic efforts away from counterterrorism, away from counterinsurgency towards great power competition, or GPC. And that really means, we are now worried more about Russia and China, and to a lesser extent, Iran, North Korea, and yes, terrorism as well, but it's taking a back seat. But and that's fine. The strategy is fine. It's not a bad assumption, but here's where I depart with it. Why does everybody, read the traditionalists in Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon and every place else, why do they assume that great power competition will be a conventional fight? They all think it's going to be conventional warfare. They all have Victor's curse. They think it's going to be World War II with better technology. So instead of having the Battle of Midway, we're going to have the Battle of Midway in the South China Sea with Ford-class carriers, F-35s, and drones. And I argue that ain't going to happen, people. That conventional war is already obsolete, and that GPC is currently an unconventional fight, not even will be an unconventional fight. It is already an unconventional fight. And that this idea of us preparing for, a high intensity conflict, it looks like World War II with better technology, we are no different than France was with their Maginot Line. We are looking to our glorified past rather than our uncomfortable future. And our adversaries are exploiting this. And look at this. Here's a chart, and it shows you all the armed conflicts since World War II. The red line on the bottom, that is normal interstate conventional war, state and state warfare, laws of warfare, military and military warfare, the wars of Clausewitz. The blue line on top, which grows bigger and bigger, that's everything else. So, if you look at this, there's nothing more unconventional than a conventional war. In fact, I argue that conventional war had a beginning, middle, and end. Its beginning was Napoleon. Its middle was the Crimean War, the US Civil War. Its end was 1945. The Cold War was not conventional. Nuclear weapons are not conventional. What we're seeing around the world today is not conventional. Occasionally, the last conventional war was probably the Falklands Island, and that wasn't even fought for conventional reasons. That was fought the Argentinian for domestic purposes of both Argentine and the United Kingdom. But we haven't seen conventional wars. And so why are we preparing for them? In fact, you could argue that we are already at war or competition or whatever word you wish to use with Russia and or China, and we don't know it, and that's by their strategic design. They could be employing a boil the frog slowly strategy that we only realize what's going on until it's too late. This will make more sense when I get into the new rules of war about what they are doing and what others are doing. Meanwhile, what are we preparing to do? I like to say, what kind of war are we preparing to fight in the future? It's actually very easy to answer. Look at what we're buying. Look at our budgets. Budgets are moral documents because they do not lie. And just so you know, our budget, we spend more in our Department of Defense. We spend more on our military than the rest of the interagency combined. That's how important the military is to us. And at the strategic level of war, you use all instruments of national power. So what does it say that we're investing everything into one instrument of national power? And people argued, we're militarizing our foreign policy, and perhaps they have a point. In fact, we spend so much on our military that we spend more money on more than the top 10 militaries in the world combined, including China, including Russia. That's how much we spend on the military. So every time somebody freaks out because, China has a new stealth fighter, I'd be like, relax, man. Look at they got a long way to go in terms of both their equipment, their funding, their leadership, their training, and also China has never won a war since 1949. They once went to war against Vietnam, and it was a huge, embarrassing disaster. So let's look at what are we buying, because the shopping list tells us where we are placing our bets for the future of war. What we're buying, the tools, the weapons, that sort of indicates what we are preparing to fight. Here's what we're buying. Now, these are top acquisitions from fiscal year 18. It could be last year, it could be the year before. It all looks the same. If you were to read that list, what kind of weapons are those tooled to fight? What kind of war are those weapons really tooled to fight? They are really for conventional war. Think of World War I, World War II, the War of Clausewitz, not the wars the last 70 years. Now, I have friends who are like, well, fine, McFate, that's great. But no, all these weapons can also fight unconventional wars too. And my response is, yeah, and a Ferrari can tow a boat. It doesn't make it a good idea. Now, I'm just going to pick on one, and I just recently wrote an op-ed for The Hill about this one that has hit a nerve. It got like record hits. That was a week and a half ago, about the F-35. Now, if there's any F-35 pilots, any Air Force pilots, fasten your seatbelt. Now, without doubt, the F-35, it's a fighter jet. It is without doubt one of the most sophisticated machines ever designed and executed by human hands. It is an amazing airplane. If you sit in its cockpit, it looks like a bunch of iPads. The pilot wears a special visor on his or her head that allow him or her to see through the fuselage in a dogfight using external sensors. It can fly through a battlefield, and it can potentially in the future team with wingman drones, bunch of drones, and it can go through a battlefield and and collectively do a target analysis. It can do smart links to U.S. weapon systems on the ground, maybe in space. It can see the enemy threats in a battlefield. It can prioritize high-value targets from non-high-value targets and then lock all fires on the high-value targets and do that instantaneously. It's a flying espionage thing. It's really pretty cool. But there's only just one problem. It's already obsolete junk. So this airplane, just so you know, the measure of any weapon system is its utility. How useful is it? The U.S. has been at war for nearly 20 years, since 9/11. Guess how many combat missions this super weapon has racked up? Zero combat missions. Now, in the last 2 or 3 years, since 2018, Lockheed Martin, who makes this plane, members of the Pentagon who were like, oh, we should really buy this plane, they were getting kind of antsy at the F-35's disgraceful war record. So they sent a few into Afghanistan, into Iraq to notch up some combat creds. But if the F-35 is taking out a moped, that's not what it was designed to do. It's taking out a terrorist on a moped. In fact, if the enemy can't shoot back, it ain't a combat mission. That's what infantry grunts like me always say. If the worst thing that could happen is engine failure, then it might as well be flying over Texas. And that's not even the worst of it. Think of the cost. Not only is this weapon doesn't go to war, but guess how much this whole program is going to cost U.S. taxpayers after 25 plus years? $1.7 trillion. To give you an idea about how many zeros that is, well, first of all, $1.7 trillion is more than Russia's GDP, all spent on a single-seat airplane. In fact, if this airplane were a country, its GDP would be ranked 11th in the world, ahead of Saudi Arabia. And it's expensive to fly, too. So all of you who are paying off student loans, think about this. Per hour, this thing costs $44,000 per hour to fly, per hour. And which is twice as much as F-15s, F-16s, F-18s, all for a weapon that doesn't go to war, that has become so exquisite. Now, the Department of Defense doesn't want to fly it because it's like the Ferrari's sitting in the garage. Don't want to risk it going over a pothole, God forbid. I say the F-35 is already obsolete. It's designed to fight last century's wars. Again, not this century's wars. There hasn't been a strategic dogfight since the Korean War. So why do we need jet fighters, especially manned ones? I say this is our Maginot Line. It's the same thing as a Maginot Line. Super expensive, super, tool to fight last century's victorious wars. This is the Maginot mentality, and it's plaguing us. We're struggling against low-level foes because we have the Maginot mentality. And that future wars will be like past successful ones, just with better technology. Meanwhile, our enemies are already outflanking us, just as the Germans outflanked the French in World War II. Okay, McFate, so fine. What does the future of war then look like? It's getting sneakier. Warfare is getting sneakier. And why is it getting sneakier? What is driving it into the shadows? Well, we live in an information age. This is why. When everybody has one of these, like an iPhone or an Android, you become reporter, videographer, editor, publisher, all at the same time, instantly. And because of the information age, weapons that give you plausible deniability are now more important than firepower. And warfare is going into the shadows because we live in an information age. For those who are strategic theorists, warfare is moving from a Clausewitzian paradigm into a Sun Tzuian one. Clausewitz was the Prussian theorist from the Napoleonic era who said basically war requires you to put force on force, military on military. Think of, again, he's a conventional war theorist, World War I, World War II. Sun Tzu is very different. He's an ancient 2,500-year-old Chinese general who wrote The Art of War, and he is very different than Clausewitz. He says he says that war is not about force on force. He says, in fact, the art of the general is to win before the first shot is fired. He says war is strategic deception, where Clausewitz says war is firepower on firepower. They are very different. Warfare is now moving from a Clausewitzian trajectory from the 20th century into a Sun Tzuian one of the 21st century. And just look at some of these wars. Since the last couple of years, these are like sort of like the Spanish Civil War before World War II. It offers us a taste of what's coming. Look at the Ukraine, a case study. The Russians in the old way of war, the conventional war, when they want to put their boot on somebody's neck, they would march in the tanks, Clausewitzian style. Think of Hungary 56, Czechoslovakia 68. They could have done that in 2014. Their military could have easily blitzkrieged into Ukraine, but they didn't do that. What did they do? They created a ghost occupation using clandestine forces like Spetsnaz special forces, mercenaries like the Wagner Group, these little green men, these astroturfed units that are called, they're like fake separatist Russian militia units controlled by the GRU. They had loads of active measures and dense propaganda, while the West was still figuring out what the heck was going on in the Ukraine. The Crimea was already a fait accompli. And only then did the conventional war weapons like tanks and destroyers show up, purely for symbology reasons, not for the fighting was already done by these other shadowy figures. Or Libya. We don't know exactly what's going on in Libya under that fog of war. We know there's insurgents, there's militia, there's Egypt, Turkey, Russia, others are playing in that sandbox. Some of it's mercenary on mercenary, like the Middle Ages. There's even oil companies sniffing around the ends of it. So that's modern war. Or Syria. In the old rules of war, so Russia has always, for example, has always had the same strategic objective, which is to disunite Europe, to break apart Europe. In the old rules of war during the Cold War, what Russia or the Soviets would do is they'd have these huge military exercises on the border of East and West Germany, like Zapad 81. And NATO didn't know if that was a legitimate military exercise or if it was a feint or a ruse that would, become a real invasion. And this would create stress fractures within the NATO alliance system. Now, when Russia wants to break apart the European Union and NATO, they do things like this. They fight the new rules of war. They weaponize refugees. They take bombers and use them in unconventional ways. They bomb civilian centers in Syria. This helps drive a tidal wave of refugees into the European Union that results in the Brexit. That results in the rise of right-wing nationalist parties across the European Union who want to break up the EU from the inside. Moscow, in the Politburo of the Cold War, would have loved for such an outcome. And Russia did it by doing sneaky, of course, unethical things by weaponizing refugees. These are all examples of the new rules of war. Mercenaries are also returning. Mercenaries are a weapon that gives you great plausible deniability because even if you capture them, you don't know for sure if they work for Russia, the US, a Middle Eastern monarchy. You have no idea. Just because they speak Arabic or English or Russian doesn't mean who their boss is. It's not like capturing a SEAL Team 6 member or Spetsnaz member. So this is why Russia is doing its first expeditionary warfare since the Cold War into the Middle East and into Africa. And their leading weapon of choice is the Wagner Group, a bunch of very lethal mercenaries. Now, to show you how mercenaries have been rising slowly for the last 25 years after the Berlin Wall fell down, here's international mercenary, in the 1990s. Here's it today. And this is sort of based on what we know. I'm not looking at small things like onesies and twosies. These are where mercenaries play a a significant role in the armed conflict, or at least not a tiny one. The red or the maroon, those are Russian. They work for the GRU or for Moscow. Blue is others, right? We even see like Green Berets, former SEAL Team 6 or SEAL members, not SEAL Team 6 members, working in Venezuela and Yemen and other places like that. Allegedly, I've got on good authority that is true. So we're seeing the rise of mercenaries, and when you have mercenaries, when you privatize war, it changes warfare in profound ways. So now the super rich can hire mercenaries, and they can wage war for themselves. So a private warfare, where warfare is no longer the exclusive domain of the state. We're seeing a schism between the state and the ability to wage war. And these mercenaries aren't all sort of like we would call dirtbags in the military. The tier 1 mercenaries, the very top ones, are like special operations units. You can rent Mi-24 attack Hind helicopters on the market, and Nigeria did. These are like flying tanks. Nigeria hired them in 2015 to wipe out some Boko Haram, and they did. So now that you have you can have private warfare where anybody can wage war for whatever reason they want. It will change international relations as we know it. International relations, political science is completely state-centric. It's Westphalian. And we're entering in a post-Westphalian era where with post-Westphalian warfare, which is what we've been seeing in the last couple of decades. In fact, states are no longer drivers of war. They can become booty of war. And let's look at narco states just south of our border in Mexico. I mean, or Guatemala or Salvador, those states there are prizes to be won, and they're called narco states by many. There's captured states, and they serve at the pleasure of narcos. So we're going to a pre-Westphalian era that looks more like the Middle Ages than the 20th century. Also, just to sort of wrap up quickly, some of the best weapons today do not fire bullets. I like to say that war is becoming epistemological, controlling narrative, disinformation, deep fakes. These are all the new ways of war. And in fact, it's how you win war, through information. So in the old rules and old conventional war CrossFits, battlefield victory determined winners and losers. Today, it's telling truth from lies. And we can even talk about this in Q&A about, is this going on in our own country? We all know there's a culture war. Do we have external powers reaching in covertly, trying to stir up the pot so we tear our throats out and then we diminish our country that way? We could discuss that, but telling truth from lies, that's where victory lies today. It's not on battlefields. In fact, you remember this, mission accomplished in 2003. The US had achieved perfect battlefield victory against Iraq's military. It was completely insignificant for the war. Completely. Also in Vietnam, we had won every battle, but not the war. And this is our problem. We are still clinging to the old rules of war. We're still clinging to World War II strategic concepts. And lastly, rule number 10. We're going to talk about the other rules in Q&A. Rule number 10 is victory is fungible. There are many ways to win. You don't have to win in a battlefield. In fact, battlefield victory, like I just said, may be fairly unusual, if not obsolete. You can win by cunning, and it's not new in history. The Trojan horse is a great example. So let me ask you this question. When was the last time anybody in this room saw a Hollywood movie with a Chinese villain? Just think about that. We see Russian villains, we see terrorist villains, we even see American villains and CEOs as villains. How come there are no Chinese villains? Kind of conspicuous. Well, the answer is because they bought Hollywood legally. Legacy Studios is owned by China. And as you know, Chinese companies are not like free market companies in the United States. They're owned by Beijing. They work for Beijing. It's a state-controlled economy. And so some of them are outright, some studios are outright owned. Others, if they want to show their movie in China, which is the second biggest, movie market in the world, they have to censor their movies. and they can never have a bad Hollywood guy or gal. And next time you watch a movie in the pre-credits, see if any of them are Mandarin, right? And this is an increasingly common thing. All these movies, China is never the bad guy, always the good guy. So we talk about how information is now decisive in warfare and how warfare is becoming, increasingly epistemological about information and manipulating people's perceptions of reality. Here, China just bought an influence WMD legally, and they're building their own in China, their own Hollywood to rival and eclipse ours someday, they hope. And so far, they're doing a pretty good job. So maybe some of you have heard recently the Wolf Warrior talk in the Anchorage, Alaska, well, it's not really a summit, but meeting between the US and China. And many US commentators are calling it Wolf Warrior China foreign policy. Well, what they're referring to is this. There's two movies, Wolf Warrior 1 and Wolf Warrior 2, that came out recently. Wolf Warrior 2, this is the one you see before you, it grossed over $800,000. That's like George Clooney, $1 million, $800 million and plus. That's like George Clooney money, right? And here's the plot. It's sort of like Rambo, a Chinese Rambo with the guy at the top. He's like a rogue Chinese special forces guy who's got a heart of gold but an authority problem. And he sees that an American private military company, think Blackwater, but really a stand-in for SEALs and for American troops, is in Africa torturing African orphans, beating up Chinese nationals, and being evil and selfish and greedy. And he goes over there to kick ass. And the bad guys here are blatantly America. Blatantly America. So this is a soft power play. There are many ways to win wars. It's not just battlefield victory. That's, as I say, kind of outmoded. There's a way where all of our grandchildren are speaking Mandarin as a second language and are sympathetic to Beijing values. Now you say, well, fine, McFate, that doesn't compute. That's pretty way out there. It's not. It's what we did to Germany after World War II. By the time their Berlin Wall fell down in 1989, West Germans were all speaking English as a second language, loved America, American culture, loved capitalism, loved everything America stood for. Their Nazi ancestors would be furious at this outcome, because this is what durable peace or durable victory looks like. It looks like that. And there's many ways to win. It's not just with militaries. And of course, what are we investing in? Militaries. Now, I say we can win in this modern geopolitical environment that's changed war, where war is getting sneakier, but we need to increase our strategic IQ. We can't be like the French with the Maginot Line, thinking that the false security of our military is okay. It's not okay. Warfare has changed. We are being lapped. That's why we struggle against low-level foes. The good news is all we got to do is change the way we fight. Rules 1 through 4 are habits we have to break. Rules 5 through 10 are new things we've got to do. Now, the conventional warrior's mind will explode. And I'm okay with that, because we are living in a post-conventional war era. The evidence for that is overwhelming if you look at the last 60 years of conflict around the world. Very little of it is conventional. You could count it on two hands versus the hundreds of other things that we don't think of as war even, but they are war. So with that, Carl, I would like to turn it over to Q&A, starting with you, sir. And do you want me to leave this up, or do you want me to take it down?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, and
yes,
let me just start the video. I would suggest that we leave the rules there. First of all, thank you very much for this fantastic talk and walking us through those rules, bad habits and good habits, and having those really provocative ideas, which might seem in certain quarters contrarian, but are very necessary to overcome what you have described, I suppose, as I would argue it's a failure of strategic imagination. And my first comment that I would like to invite from you, based on this presentation and based on the book and the reactions, is to comment a little bit about what needs to happen in order this strategic failure of strategic imagination to be overcome. Where should we pay attention? Because it will be tied to a second comment about the near peer adversaries, to which lessons they have paid closer attention to the ones that we have not been, according to your claims.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that for a victorious nation like ours, it usually takes a lot of blood to change our way of warfare, to up our strategic IQ, to increase our strategic imagination. And sometimes not even after that do people change their way of warfare. I mean, look at France after World War I, at the losses at the Somme, the losses at Verdun, and they still didn't change or upgrade their strategic thinking. Germany did because they were desperate. They had to innovate. And they did innovate. So usually hunger, it's sort of like, in some ways, I guess, capitalism, like desperation and hunger lead to innovation. And we feel comfortable, and our enemies and adversaries know that. So what they do is they don't want to poke the beast. And what everybody knows, especially America's adversaries, is this. If you go up against the United States on a conventional head-on-head force, you're going to get wiped out, right? But America struggles mightily with unconventional war. So guess how they're going to come after us? Unconventionally. And they are, I would argue, using disinformation. And they're using these other types of like mercenaries and other things they're doing, not against the United States per se, but about in regions that we care about. Like that's what Russia and China, that's what Russia is doing in Africa and the Middle East. Mm-hmm. China is doing other things through Belt Road Initiative, through their own disinformation campaigns, through lawfare, but they wage war, but disguise it as peace, because we have a bunch of conventional warriors in Washington who only, if it doesn't look like Tom Clancy or World War II, it's not war. Call of Duty, it must not be war.
Thank you for commenting on this. Again, I will take this opportunity, to have quotes from your book because we have a number of questions, very interesting ones that are coming from our audience. But before that, I would like to ask several quotes which kind of stuck with me for a long time. I had to think about them, especially in academic debates. And one of them is that cyber is important, but not in the ways people think. Would you elaborate on this?
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about cyber nowadays. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, please. Thank you for that. So cyber, it's like the F-35 for me. It gets me going. So for all of you, every generation, every 10 years, the Pentagon has a new watchword that if you put out your hands and say, cyber dash whatever, your pet project, money goes into your hands. Today it's cyber. 10 years ago it was coin, counterinsurgency. 10 years before that, it was RMA, Revolution of Military Affairs. So cyber is the new hot ticket. For some of you want to pay off student loans, just go cyber, the rubber duck syndrome, or whatever you want to do, and you'll get money. The truth is if you ask, 10 cyber experts to, what is cyber exactly, you'll get 15 answers. It is because it's a word that means nothing. It's ones and zeros in space. That's, is an email a cyber weapon? And unfortunately, for some strange reason in our strategic community, we conflate cyber with information. It's not. Cyber is just another vector for information, like the radio, like TV, like, yes, newspapers, like Twitter. It's just another vector. And why is it important? People tend to think it's because there's Hollywood movies who use, every time a hacker touches a keyboard, they become a god. Think of there's like a James Bond movie, especially, I forget what it was, but basically it's not, the importance of cyber is this. It's not sabotage. It's not like Stuxnet. It's generally influence. It's disinformation. So if you want to start, if you want to help take down the United States, you don't do it by blitzkrieging into California. You'll be shot off the coast probably. The way to do it, not to defeat the US, but to diminish it, is you use disinformation and you find seams in our social fabric. And then you pour kerosene on it, light it on fire, and rip it apart through disinformation. You get red states and blue states at each other's throats, so we destroy ourselves from within by stirring the proverbial pot through disinformation, so that we diminish, not that we go away, but that we diminish as a world power, creating a vacuum for China, for Russia, for others to step into. And that's what's going on. Now, there have been some recent attacks, like in December, Russia launched a huge attack. We don't know exactly publicly what was taken. But again, it's not to do sabotage, it's to do espionage, data collection, etc. And that's where cyber is significant. But it's not this gee whiz stuff from a lot of Hollywood shows.
Thank you very much for commenting on this. And this is partially tied, I wanted to go back to rule number 4, that hearts and minds do not matter at tactical and operational level. And I would like to provoke you, just said about influence and so on. And yet you're saying, look, rule number 4, hearts and minds do not matter. Would you elaborate on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, thank you. So as we know from rule number 5, and I've just said, that at the strategic level of war, winning hearts and minds is supreme. Right, that's supreme. What rule number 4 is, it's in the bad habits we have to break. It's written for a particular audience. It's written for Department of Defense about how the American counterinsurgency strategy does not work. It does not work because it was strategically, Petraeus and others, it was ill-conceived. And we can go in a deep dive about this, but it's basically the strategic logic of counterinsurgency as the US practiced it at the tactical and operational levels of war. Think of on the ground in Iraq, on the ground in Afghanistan, is this. If we bribe the local people to like us, they will give us their allegiance. But it doesn't work. So imagine this, that China goes to El Paso and they say, hey, you've got problems here. We will build you free housing, give you free healthcare, food subsidies, and we'll build you a football stadium and pay for a football team. But all you've got to do is vote for our candidate in the next congressional election. And oh, by the way, we are running communist candidates through all the districts in the United States. We call them socialists or whatever. What would people of El Paso say? They would say, we'll take all of your stuff, but we ain't voting commie. And that's exactly what happened with American coin in Iraq and Afghanistan. They took all of our stuff, but lo and behold, you can't bribe populations to like you. And that's what we went in there with, thinking like, if we give them government services by social contract, they'll give us their allegiance. But the social contract theory is not universal. It's a construction that came out of Western Europe around the 18th century.
Thank you, Sean, for this. Thank you for going into detail, because this is important. Before I go, because we have multiple and very interesting questions, I'll use my last question, and it has to do a lot with what we are scrutinizing here at UT Austin, specifically regarding the future of intelligence studies. And I would like to relate this to rule number 6, mercenaries will return. I want to hear your thoughts or comments. What is the applicability to do this rule number 6 for the world of intelligence collection analysis, and do we see similar tendencies in your opinion? And fusion, of course.
Yeah, so the intelligence community in our country does not collect on mercenaries. They collect on GPC, great power competition, and they collect on terrorists. And they view mercenaries as cartoonish Hollywood bad guys. Which is not true. I mean, mercenaries are very lethal, maybe not to American forces, but they're very lethal in most parts of the world, places that we care about. And what does it mean when ExxonMobil gets its own army someday, or an oligarch gets its own army someday, or a mega church? Like there's a big one in Houston. I'm not saying they would do this, but they have mega bucks. Just say there's another ISIS 2.0 or something like that in the Levant. And they feel like, well, the international community is feckless, so we're going to pay mercenaries to do a humanitarian intervention to safeguard Christian communities so that Christian men are not crucified and Christian women and girls are not sold on sex slave markets. And and you could do that. You could hire mercenaries today to set up islands of humanity to shoot ISIS 2.0, but safeguard Christian communities and air resupply them, just until you can create enough international movement for a real peacekeeping operation. Would that suck the US into a war in Iraq or Syria, right? Would it suck others into a war? These things, we are in our IC, our intel community is also very state-centric, and especially with great power competition, people think it's going to be some sort of new Cold War. You know, that's an analogy which is overdone and can be strategically misleading, leading to intelligence failure. So mercenaries change warfare and strategies in profound ways. Think of Adam Smith meets Clausewitz. It's market strategy meets military strategy. Our 4 stars and others in the IC do not know how to game that out. Machiavelli did, because that's, you know, mercenaries are the second oldest profession. They've always been a part of war, except for the last 200 years. So the significance of mercenaries is profound for the IC, but we're not even collecting on them.
Thank you for commenting this. Yes, it's a very interesting and kind of idea that you're developing in your previous academic work as well, about the old versus new normal, where actually the standing armies are the novelty versus, you know, the mercenary force. With that, Sean, I will start addressing questions that have gathered in our from our attendants and participants. And I'll start with Donald Baldwin, and if you excuse me, you know, sometimes if I mispronounce someone's name, who says, on Iran, the US team of Obama, Biden, Kerry, and Sherman are back, ex-Obama. Since the US was out-negotiated by the Islamic Republic on the nuclear agreement, do you believe Biden, Kerry, and Sherman have learned anything?
What we're seeing, in my opinion, it's just simply my opinion, is we're seeing a third Obama administration. And I know a lot of people in the national security billets for both the current one and the Obama one. And this is not a genius crew. They gave us a surge in Afghanistan. They gave us red lines in Syria. They gave us the Libya war, which kind of went nowhere. And the Iran deal, which is still very theoretical. All I could say is that our 2 allies in the region closest to the problem, which is, you know, Israel and Saudi Arabia, thought it was a terrible deal. And I think that Kerry and Tony Blinken and Jake Sherman are mired in the 20th century. They also have, I mean, I've given this type of talk at the State Department, and it's often, people say you should write a book called The New Rules of Diplomacy, because notions of international law, notions of statecraft, of good old-fashioned diplomacy, I think it's, you know, it's changed, just like war has changed, and they're stuck in the wrong century. And I am not optimistic about such things.
Thank you, Sean. The next question that we have, it is from an attendee who says, one can argue that we're, as you mentioned, one can argue that we are already at war. So what war are we currently fighting with China and Russia?
Yeah, so first of all, I wish we had a better word for war. One of my rules here is number 3, is that there's no such thing as war or peace, there's war and peace. And we tend to think about, for the last 30 years, we've gone to thinking that war is like pregnancy. You either are or you're not. But in truth, it's always some mixture. And our Cold Warriors knew that. I mean, the Cold War was not just a metaphor. If you ask people at that time, I'll say, yeah, it was a real war. It wasn't a metaphor. Whereas it's like war and poverty is a metaphor. So we use the word competition instead of war, which is frankly a sucky term as well. So if anybody has a better word for war or for competition, please email me. We need something better. But I mean, yeah, so China and Russia want different things. China wants, it said it wants to become the regional hegemon of Indo-Pacific by October 1st, 2049. And they're doing that, I think. They're on their way, whether they will succeed. I don't want to be a China-like hysteria person. They may crumble. They have a lot of problems, but they may succeed. That's a nuanced debate. Russia is doing something different. They're not trying to to replace the current American world order with their own. They just want to punch holes into the Western world order and then exploit it for gain, exploit it for advantage. And that seems to be working for them. I mean, the reason that they're in Libya is not because they need more sweet crude oil. They don't. They're a petro economy. The reason that they're in Libya is the same reason that they're in Ukraine. Libya, whoever owns Libya, quote unquote owns it, controls a spigot of refugees from Africa, small arms, drugs, all sorts of things that go from Africa through Libya into the EU. And if you want to get the EU's attention and bring the pinch on them, you open that spigot. And they could do that right now with pipeline, the pipeline wars of Ukraine. They can, cut off German industrial sector from its energy. It gets 20% of its energy from Russian power. That makes them very political. Makes Russia very political. So there's a method to Russia's madness. It's not to replace the world order, but it's to put pressure on. And I think they're also meddling. They're using disinformation to weaken us. And I'm not saying that they're swinging close elections. We think they'd like to, but we're on that road. And Russia is doing it, but so is China. Has something called the three warfare strategy, which is also about manipulating information. Both these powers are trying to do that. Does it rise to the threshold of war? Rule number 3, it doesn't matter. Remove the threshold of war. There's no such thing as war or peace. It's war and peace. So international lawyers, we can quibble, and I'm happy to quibble with international lawyers. But we need to be more nuanced. Our strategic imagination has to be much more nuanced than it is.
Thank you, Sean, for addressing this. And I really like your comment about the method to the madness. I really enjoy it. Next question, comes from Russell Holstein, who says, aren't the Israelis using the F-35 in combat? They just ordered 25 more. Why is this plane working for them, but not for the US? Yeah.
So I spent 3 months in Israel as a guest professor at their war college when I was researching and writing this book. And Israel and it's interesting. It's an interesting place. Their strategic culture is very interesting. In some ways, it mirrors United States is. In other ways, it's quite different. I think they're using F-35 as a political favor for the Pentagon and others. They could use it F-15 for what they're doing. I don't think it's not a uniquely suited F-35 mission. But also there's some evidence of this. Is that here's talking about strategy, culture eats strategy for breakfast. That the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, developed long-range accurate rockets that are cheap. They can strike where F-15s normally strike, and they don't risk, losing a pilot if they get shot down. And I heard, take this for what you will, that the Israeli army secretly kiboshed it because they didn't want to be out of a job. And that, frankly, if you're like an F-15 pilot, that's one of the sexiest things you can be in the IDF. And we see it today. We see it with our own Air Force resisting drones. They still want manned aircraft because of the strategic culture around it. And it's an example about how strategic culture misleads us down the wrong road. But I would say that F-35s they could use F-15s or other weapons. It doesn't have to be an F-35. I think they're doing it as a political favor for Lockheed.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for addressing this one. The next one is whether or not focusing on total defense spending conceals more than it reveals. That is, with the commentary that the military spending strategic strengths have altered rather dramatically over the past few decades. And in the early 2000s, it was conventional to say that we were spending more than 20 countries, most of whom of those are allies. Now, in 5 years, maybe 6 to 8, or assuming that even moderate forecasts in the Chinese economic growth will hold, we might find ourselves outspent in the next in the next 20 to 40 years. So they don't have many obligations and so on. So is it this total defense spending conceals more than it reveals? What do you think?
Well, there's a couple ways people measure defense. They do it. Some people measure it by dollars, and of course, the accounting in the Pentagon is kind of voodoo. Some people measure it by percentage of GDP. In which case, the Korea War was probably the most expensive. That was probably the highest threshold for America. I still think it's a useful number to have. It puts things in perspective. I also don't correlate because China spends, we spend like for every. the question is, how well do we spend each defense dollar? And we have a military industrial complex like Lockheed, which is almost criminal. It is almost, I mean, so the F-35, it can't fly, can't do any of the things it really promised. They can't do them well. Each problem, they've got to do another budget cycle. It's already like they have a glitchy computer code. They have 8 million lines of code in that plane. 8 million lines, which is glitchy and hackable. And right now they have like I guess like a 15 or $13 billion fix that's 2 years overdue. And Lockheed is saying, we can fix the problem, but you have to give us an exclusive maintenance contract to do it. And Eisenhower would be flipping in his grave right now, right? The military industrial complex. So, and also I want to get to this point, like, you can win without having to go to war. I think we should maintain our conventional force as a deterrent, but we don't need these exquisite weapon systems like Ford-class carriers at $13 billion a copy or F-35s. The F-22, the F-15 is fine for our needs, but I don't think there's going to be a battle of Midway, which is going to decide things like in World War II. I think there are new ways to win, these ways that you see on the screen, where we suddenly, like, maybe all of our grandchildren are like, we like Russia, we like China, we all speak Mandarin, etc. So I think there's many ways to win, and focusing on expensive, exquisite weapon systems and focusing, I mean, the budget, as I say, is really just shows you where we're committing our money. And I think it's also important for domestic politics is, what's the opportunity cost, not just for DOD, but for, we need more State Department. Maybe we need better IC stuff. There's also other things maybe we should be considering rather than these exquisite, expensive weapon systems that don't go to war.
And thank you for addressing this, because the next question, which is coming from Michael Ard, is interesting. It ties to some of those comments. And he's commenting and actually asking for a comment as well. He says that we build some weapons to use, we build other weapons for deterrence. Weapons that we never use still have utility. What combat has the Ohio class SSBN seen? Comment?
Yeah, so nuclear weapons served as a deterrent and mutually assured destruction in the Cold War. Are they deterrent today? That's a good question. The F-35 is definitely not a deterrent. I mean, Lockheed and others, same with the Ford-class carrier, definitely not a deterrent. Our superlative military is not a deterrent. It's not stopping Chinese expansion in the South China Sea. It's not stopping Russian expansion into the Middle East and into Africa. It's not stopping Iran from mucking around the Levant. It didn't stop ISIS or Al Qaeda or anything like that. So, if somebody's going to make the argument that we need this big military as a deterrent, my answer is like, fine, show me evidence it's deterring. Maybe there's other types of deterrents that we need. For example, if our enemies are using disinformation to attack us, to undermine our elections, to undermine our faith in our government, to undermine our faith in the rule of law, then that's a way of winning, right? Then how do we defend against that without just being a goalie at a penalty shootout? Trying to make what I call plausible deniability, implausible deniability. But the truth is that these disinformation superpowers can spit out more BS than we can rectify. So maybe a deterrent is that we have to get into the shadows and punch back. We have to get in the shadows like we did in the Cold War and start. Can we create a disinformation campaign within China to loosen, to make the masses distrust the elite, to make Putin rides around half naked on bears? Can we do something with that? Can we ridicule that? So that the best offense, the best defense is an offense. Would that be a better deterrent than spending all these trillions of dollars on weapons that we know are not deterring?
What you're calling sexy technology, right?
Yeah, it's sexy gee whiz technology. So I think we should think about that. But here's the rub, and here's one of the important takeaways about the new rules of war, which I don't answer because it's too big. I observe that war is going underground and into the shadows, and it's getting more secret. I'm not advocating that. That's what I'm observing. And I also say that maybe for deterrent reasons, we have to get in there as well and punch back in the shadows. But we know from the 1970s with the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission and et cetera, that secrets and democracy are not compatible. So if war is going into secret realms, how do we fight it secretly without losing our democratic soul? That's the national discourse we should be having right now, not how many F-35s or Ford-class carriers we need. It's how do we fight this new type of warfare without losing our democratic soul?
Thank you, Sean. And also Emily Whalen, who is thanking you for the great talk, says that you mentioned Sun Tzu in the Middle Ages and a few other historical examples of the rules you described. So her question is, what makes your rules the new rules of war as opposed to the very old rules of war?
Yeah, so there's actually nothing new in this. Warfare, old as dirt. What this proposes, this looks, first of all, when I give this talk around the world before COVID, a lot of countries are like, yeah, we actually kind of do this already, like Poland or parts of Asia or they're like, this doesn't look so novel. And it looks novel to the Western, particularly to the American conventional warrior. It looks novel to the political scientist because this is what's been going on for the last 70 years. The reason it looks new to us is because we have confirmation bias and what we tend to privilege as war versus not war. And we are also influenced by Tom Clancy, by Hollywood, all these things, that it just looks new. Nothing in here is new. All this is how wars were kind of fought in the Middle Ages. This is how I fought with integrity, ancient antiquity, excuse me. But Sun Tzu says all war is strategic deception. He's not kidding. He's like, fake out your enemy. Can you do false flag operations today where you got two enemies and you bait them so they go to war against each other, not knowing that you set them up? Right? There's all sorts of things. If you want to take on Russia or China, we all lament about how brittle, democracy is so vulnerable, they're infiltrating our elections, but democracy is very resilient. Autocracy, this way of war favors autocracy because they centralize power at the very top. They can have state-controlled media. They can keep secrets. But autocracies are also very brittle, which makes them vulnerable. So we could use the new rules of war against autocracies too. So for example, there's many ways we could do this. But for example, most autocracies, they'll take Russia or China, have an autocrat at top for life who's very nervous about his, lifehood, like his living, when will he die? Is there a way that we could covertly create the impression that some of his lieutenants want to have a palace coup and execute him? Will he take out his lieutenants for us? That's Sun Tzu. That's not Clausewitz. And that's what I'm trying to get us to move the needle towards. Is this, and Cold Warriors used to think this way. Now, there's a lot of risks to doing that, but there's a lot of risks to the status quo as well.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you for elaborating on new versus old and the novelty, or not so new, some lessons. And I would like to thank Emily as well for putting those questions. Now, two very important questions, I think, that are coming from James Galbraith. First, being agreeing with you that Russia has changed its methods of warfare. It has reduced its military by 90% after the Cold War and then built back a very different force capable of fighting effectively in Georgia, Syria, etc. Why are you so sure that their objective of the Russian Federation remains the same as the one you attribute to the Soviet Union of the 50s and the 60s? This would be the first question.
Yeah.
And then the second one, on a more narrow topic, are you sure it was the Russians who supported the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad and who only intervened in Syria in 2015 and not the Syrian rebellion and the civil war that broke out in 2011 that produced the flood of Syrian refugees to Europe?
On the second, it's both. There was already a flood of refugees. The Russians hastened it along. I think that and they made good use of it. And I think the Soviets had different grand strategic aims in Russia. I mean, the Soviets wanted to be a world power. And we could discuss that about what did communism mean over the decades to different Soviet leaders and what was the Soviet Union in the 80s versus in the 50s. But I think it's fair to say that the Soviets and the Russians today would like to see a more disunited Europe than exists, and seeing the EU break apart, seeing NATO, break apart. I mean, that I think that would be in their self-interest, and I think we've seen a lot of evidence for that, especially as they meddle with elections. What is Russia's grand aim right now? I don't know. I think it's just to be taken seriously as a superpower, but they're doing it the way they're trying to achieve it is, I think, using sort of things that look like they're new rules of war to punch holes in the current American Western rules-based order, not to replace it. I think China wants to supplant it. I think Russia just wants to diminish it and become a player again. So, I don't think it's identical to the USSR, but I do think that they have some things in common.
Thank you, Sean. Another one that comes from Eliaun, who again is thanking you very much for this conversation and presentation. And she's asking, what role can the artificial intelligence play in the future of war?
Yeah, so this gets to an earlier question about cyber. I tend to be I'm an AI skeptic because, AI keeps on being a moving target. So like, look, here's an iPhone, right? Now, 15 years ago, Siri would be considered AI. Now it's just an app. People sell ideas. Most AI is completely hypothetical. It's in the realm of science fiction. I'm a novelist as well, as you can say. So I know good science fiction or fiction when I see it. They talk about it like Skynet and, HAL 9000. But the truth is that most, learning algorithm machines are pretty primitive. They're not much better than a toddler or even worse than a toddler. Maybe they're good at a couple things, but there's a lot of hoopla about a lot of jazz hands when it comes to cyber and in warfare, which I think is just people selling stuff. So there is potential in the future, but I would just argue, be a savvy buyer and ask to see evidence, not just like, most time it's just like, well, it's over the horizon. I can't tell you yet, it's classified, or just, it's going to be this way. I'm like, it's like the flying car. We've been hearing about the flying car since the 1960s. And it really hasn't happened yet. So I would encourage you to be a savvy consumer of AI, and I still don't know what AI really means. We don't know what it is.
A bit of a skeptic, especially on the buzzwords, from my understanding. Sean, here is an interesting question from my colleague Mark Pomar, who is commenting and asking the following thing. He says, we won the Cold War by using unconventional warfare. Note the importance of VOA, RFE, RL, soft power, pop culture, etc. How do you see international broadcasting as a weapon for the 2020s?
Well, I think the strategy of international broadcasting is critical. I don't think we should, we talked about reviving the U.S. Information Agency, which hosts VOA, but I think we just need to bring it to the 21st century. I mean, I agree. Like, how do we weaponize information? And obviously we have a lot of self-constraint with freedom of the press, etc. But how do we do it in a way that we are the country that invented Hollywood, Madison Avenue, and social media? How do we keep on getting strategically outlapped by clumsy autocracies, by primitive, Al-Qaeda's, etc.? So this is, I absolutely agree with you. I just don't know exactly how to do that. There's been multiple workarounds, attempts at this in the last 20 years in the State Department and DOD. They've mostly gone up in failure. We also have some structural issues in our legally, like the Smith-Mundt Act, like our authorities about who can do what. We have laws in the books that are pre-email era that dictate how we use information technology. And I don't know what to do about that, because we need legislation like Goldwater Nichols. It probably not going to happen anytime soon. But this is, I think, where we should be spending our money, not on F-35s again, to pick on F-35s, but in this question about strategic influence, strategic communication.
Thank you for this comment. Yes, something to really think about and work, it's a work in progress. But also I'll jump for an email question to you from Kelly Jordan, who's an associate professor at the American Military University, who's asking you, can you elaborate on your idea of developing war artists in terms of how to do it effectively?
Yeah, there's a lot in this book, actually. And one of the things that I discussed is something that we need war artists. So strategic thinking, strategic thought is a different type of thinking than, say, tactical thinking. Tactical thinking, it's a difference between something that's complicated versus complex from systems theory. Something that's complicated is like a 747. It's made of a billion parts. It takes a certain type of genius to make it and to put it together, but it's solvable. You can take it apart and put it back together, and it should fly. Whereas international relations problems, national security problems are complex problems. Complex problems are not rational, they're nonlinear complexity, and they cannot be solved. Like, say, a family, or there's no algorithm to predict what the Senate's going to do. You have too many independent variables and other things that make it too difficult to solve. Meanwhile, national security problems are what we call wicked problems. A wicked problem is so complex, it has at least these three characteristics. One, the experts can't agree on the nature of the problem. Two, there's no agreement on how to solve it. And here's the kicker. Three, you may not know if you solved it until a generation later. That's what most national security problems are. They're wicked problems. And to think about that, you need to be comfortable with thinking about ambiguity and not sort of like social science, or not sort of like a linear complexity, but nonlinear complexity. And you need to be like an artist. So an artist is somebody who can improvise to a jazz tune, doesn't need to have sheet music to read it. And that's what great strategists do. They can think that way. Now, meanwhile, our military prizes tactical thinkers, which tend to be engineering thinkers. If you look at the curriculums of like West Point and Annapolis, they are completely engineering. Even if you're an English major, you get a BS degree because it's an engineering curriculum. And so people want to look for, checkbox solutions to war. That doesn't work at the strategic level of war. You've got to think like a war artist. And and war artists and great strategic thinkers, I kind of like agree with the Ratatouille rule. They can come from, anywhere. Not everybody can be a great strategic thinker, but they can come from anywhere. They may not come from the uniformed services. They might come from, Silicon Valley or a scholar or something like that. I mean, look at Lincoln. He was a great strategic thinker. Nothing in his background would show you that. He was a great strategic thinker. So war. I'm kind of droning on, but yeah, we need war artists who can think on the fly creatively.
Thank you very much. I know that we're almost out of time, but I'll try to squeeze in couple of more questions. And I know that the interest is high, which means that we probably need to do another event, if you agree. But
sure.
One from Larry O'Brien, who wants your thoughts on, first of all, offensive cyber operations against our adversaries and the risk of tit-for-tat escalation, and AI automation weapons in the future, and how non-manned systems, as they advance and evolve, will change warfare, including with non-state actors. So offensive. Yeah,
I'll try to be very quick. Because I don't want to fit in some questions. So this is what most people, when they think about the future of war, that's what they think about. But war has three levels. There's at the bottom, the tactical level, which is the perspective of like the soldier or the platoon or the battleship. At the middle level is the operational art level. That's the military campaign or campaigns. At the senior level is the strategic level. And that's where it's armed politics, where military victories translate into political ones and vice versa. If that's not happening, you're at the operational art level. Most of these weapons are really for the tactical and operational art level. Meanwhile, we're getting our lunch eaten at the strategic level. And we get the arm part right, but we don't get the politics part right. And so, and I think a lot of the discussion around AI, automation, et cetera, I think a lot of that is hype. I really do. And again, I'm a doubting Thomas who says, show me. Give me evidence, and don't just theorize and make it into fiction. And there's a lot of people who make it into fiction, and it's over the horizon, but it's sort of like it never. It's like the F-35. It just like it's been 25 years in the making. At some point, you got to say basta. Let's move forward. So I'm a skeptic about some of those things. Yeah.
The next question that I would like to address comes from Dr. Iskra Ivanov, who is asking, thanking you for the exceptional presentation, and he's asking if you agree with Graham Allison that the war between the U.S. and China is inevitable after all.
Yeah, Graham Allison was one of my advisors at Harvard, and no, I don't think so. I mean, first of all, this may be kind of just colorful, but he doesn't know much about China. He knows even less about the Peloponnesian War, and even this idea of offensive realism that rising powers will automatically go to war with reigning ones, I think is a theory in search of fact. I think there's plenty of examples in history where that's not been the case, and also I don't see any reason why China and the U.S. ought to go to war. Even like Donald Kagan, who is a Mr. Peloponnesian War from Yale, who's now retired, has said that on multiple occasions, both Sparta and Athens could have opted out. Just like I don't think it was inevitable in World War I that after Archduke Ferdinand II was killed, that was inevitable that the countries would have gone to war. I just reject, I'm a history undergrad major, that things are always inevitable. There's agency as well as structure and in national security. And I think that to me, Graham Allison's book had a lot of boogeyman jazz hands in it to get read and get eyeballs. And I think that's kind of, personally, I think it's a little reckless. But, some people think that's possible.
Trap can be avoided. So thank you, Sean. Two last ones I'll take. One of them connected to China, and the one being, given that China has the Great Firewall, thereby theoretically insulating their citizens from U.S. propaganda, how does the U.S. and the West counter China's aggressive disinformation, creates army of trolls in unregulated social media like Facebook, Twitter, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one is not a good answer. Is like, can we find some way to innovate around it that people can VPN up to satellites or something like that? And I don't have a tech solution for that. Also, can we put people on the ground? I mean, if you really want to play hardball with the new rules of war, there are several things we could do in China. Could we promote and support a real no-nonsense insurgency in the West? And could they become a vector of disinformation or information? I think for these types of centralized authorities like Russia and China, you don't have to even do disinformation. You just put the truth out there and let it circulate. Can we do color revolutions, whether it be in Kiev or Hong Kong? Can we do more of those? There's many. There could be other ways in that don't require ones and zeros. You just get us across the border and do something from the inside. So I think to think creatively and critically, that's the strategic thinking that we need to get through things or bypass things like the firewall, the Great Firewall. I don't have a tactical solution. I would otherwise be hawking it and getting billions of dollars.
Thank you, Sean. And the last question, although you yourself probably will see that we have multiple others. Obviously, the talk has, and I know that the book is creating a lot of interest and discussions. But the last one is will be a question that ties, to our earlier work in your long-standing interest focused on the privatization of force and mercenaries. And of course, we always know this discussion between mercenary and private contractors and the definitions and so on. But the last question for today was coming from Alex Bain, who would like to follow the line of the future of mercenaries. Blackwater, he says, was shut down over ITAR violations, but Wagner do not have congressional committees to answer to. And his questions are, how can a Western PMCs thrive in this world of double standard warfare? And can American PMC companies be competitive on a global scale in this way?
Yeah, but they're going to have to become full on mercenary. I think, first of all, when we think of like the Wagner Group, don't think of it as a Russian PMC or mercenary. You can think of Prigozhin at the top as being loyal to Putin, but the rank and file, they'll move around contract to contract. And today they might be working for Moscow. Next year, they may be working for the Emirates. The year after that, they may be working for ExxonMobil. It's a free market. It's a true free market, and the individuals make choices. The second is that I think PMCs made a play at being legitimate. Western PMCs made a play at being legitimate with the International Code of Conduct Association in Switzerland. It hasn't gone anywhere. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. It's a good idea, but it just didn't have what it needed. I think those individuals who would have worked for Blackwater or someplace like that will now go work for whomever. We see some of them in the UAE and some of them elsewhere fighting for non-American things. And I also think international law is futile, because who is going to go into Libya and arrest all those mercenaries? The UN, NATO, the Marine Corps? No. And also mercenaries can shoot back. They can kill your law enforcement dead. So there's nothing in the way to stop the rise of mercenaries. And it's actually, the more interesting question is, why were there no mercenaries in the last 200 years? Because throughout all of history, mercenaries have been a major factor of war. Nobody's asking the obvious question. That's a strange question to ask. Why were they underground? Now they're coming back. We're back to really sort of situation normal, and we should expect more private warfare going forward.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of me and my colleagues at the three centers, ISP, Clements, and Strauss, would like to thank you for this wonderful presentation. Again, we're looking forward to staying in contact, looking very much forward to your future work and commentary. Thank you for being with us today, Sean.
Thanks, it's a pleasure. And yeah, anytime, happy to come back. It's always a good Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you.